The first time Lucas compared me to her, I laughed, thinking it was a bad joke. We were sitting in the car after his corporate retreat, and he casually said, "You know, Elena wouldn't have worn flats to a black-tie dinner." I thought maybe he was tipsy or still caught up in CEO glamour. But he turned to me with that smug smirk he wore when closing deals and added, "She just understands the image that power demands." I stared out the window, biting my cheek until the metallic taste of blood dulled the sting in my chest. Before I continue narrating the story of Clara, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. I'd married Lucas 7 years ago, back when he sold real estate from a shared desk in a strip mall. Back then, he said I was his lucky charm, that my quiet strength kept him grounded. I supported him through night classes and cold-calling marathons, always believing in the vision he painted for us. The one where we'd build something together, where loyalty and love mattered more than appearances. But now, appearances were all he cared about, and Elena, his company's magnetic CEO, was the embodiment of that obsession. The first time I met her, she was speaking at their company gala, flawless in a tailored black jumpsuit, her voice syrupy with confidence. Lucas kept glancing at her during the speech, the kind of gaze that lingers too long to be professional. I brushed it off, telling myself that admiration didn't always mean desire. But when she shook my hand, her eyes swept over me like I was a puzzle, missing too many pieces. "You must be the woman behind the man," she said, her smile just wide enough to sting. Lucas used to love that I was quiet, methodical, and deeply rooted in integrity. But lately, my caution bored him, and my stability made him restless. He started pointing out Elena's decisiveness, her daring wardrobe, the way she commanded a room like she owned the air. "You could learn from her," he'd say. "Try being less safe." Every time he said her name, it felt like he was chiseling away at who I was, reshaping me into something I never agreed to become. At first, I tried harder, thinking maybe I'd let our relationship grow stale. I bought a red dress he never commented on, read business books he never asked about, and even signed up for public speaking lessons. But with every effort, he seemed more amused than impressed. "That's cute," he said once, watching me rehearse a speech in the mirror. It was the same tone he used when the dog chased its tail. Eventually, I stopped trying to win him back and started observing instead. I began noticing patterns in his behavior. Late-night texts he tilted away from me, sudden gym memberships, and the cologne that wasn't mine. The final confirmation came on a Thursday night when he left his laptop open while taking a shower. The email was from Elena, subject line, "About last night." I didn't read it. I didn't need to. The next morning, I made him breakfast like I always did. Scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, whole wheat toast. He kissed my forehead absent-mindedly and said, "You're always so consistent, Clara." I watched him walk out the door, knowing his definition of consistency had turned into code for predictable. That word used to mean dependable. Now it just meant forgettable. I spent the afternoon on the floor of our walk-in closet, sorting through pieces of myself. T-shirts from our road trip down the Pacific coast, heels I hadn't worn since his last promotion party, a silk scarf I bought in Florence. My life felt like a museum of memories curated for someone who'd stopped visiting. I realized then that I didn't want him back. I wanted myself back. That evening, Lucas came home late, smelling like something expensive and unfamiliar. His tie was loose, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and there was glitter near his ear. "Elena thinks I could be more than just regional VP," he said, pouring himself whiskey. "She sees potential." I nodded, holding my wine glass with both hands so he wouldn't see them shake. He started talking about the annual luxury gala Elena hosted every spring, calling it the event that makes careers. This year, spouses were invited, but I wasn't surprised when he suggested I might feel out of place. "It's going to be pretty intense. A-list guests, political donors, fashion editors." I tilted my head and smiled. "You think I can't handle it?" He shrugged, then smirked. "I just don't want you to feel uncomfortable, that's all." The way he said it made me feel like a charity case. I swallowed the last of my wine and said nothing, but in my head, I started making lists. I used to run logistics for a crisis management firm before switching to consulting. Lucas never understood what that entailed, how my job was to find calm in chaos, to spot the vulnerabilities in systems and people before everything imploded. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was precise and quiet, just like me. And it taught me how to wait. I waited until the week before the gala to book my dress fitting. I found a designer downtown who specialized in understated elegance, deep green silk, custom-tailored to fit like memory. The saleswoman said I looked like someone with secrets. I told her everyone does. They just don't always know it. 2 nights before the gala, Lucas returned home giddy, rambling about the VIP list and how Elena had really pulled strings this year. He didn't notice the change in my tone or the way I measured each word like currency. He mentioned there would be private rooms for donors and networking. I asked if spouses were allowed in those too. He waved me off. Not really your scene, Clara. Then he added, but Elena did say you're welcome, as long as you don't mind being a little bored. I smiled, my eyes steady. I'll find ways to entertain myself. The day of the gala, I dressed slowly, watching the city wake up outside our penthouse window. The sunlight pooled across the floor like gold on marble. Lucas was in the bathroom shaving, humming something upbeat. This is going to be a big night for us, he said, like I was part of the campaign again. But I wasn't campaigning anymore. When we arrived, the gala was already buzzing with opulence. Live orchestra, crystal chandeliers, servers moving like ballet dancers. Elena stood near the entrance, surrounded by a half-moon of admirers. She saw Lucas first, touching his arm with practiced familiarity. Then her eyes met mine. Clara, she said, her voice sweet but taut. Didn't expect you to brave the circus. I smiled, stepping closer, letting her see the calm in my eyes. Circuses are fascinating. It's always the ones in costume who fall first. Elena blinked, her smile tightening just slightly at the corners. Lucas didn't notice. He was too busy waving down a waiter to order us champagne like we were celebrating something. I let them talk over me, nodding politely while I scanned the room's layout with quiet precision. The gala had been carefully constructed, separate wings for donors, executives, and press, with private rooms in the west corridor. I filed that away, noting who slipped in and out with discreet smiles and glittering lanyards. Elena's assistant handed her a silver envelope, and she glanced at it before turning to Lucas. "The networking lounge opens in 20 minutes, she said, brushing imaginary lint from her lapel. "It's invitation only, but I made sure you're on the list." Then she turned to me with that same sugar-coated smirk. "Of course, spouses usually enjoy the atrium. It's quieter there." Lucas leaned in and kissed my temple, completely unaware of how that patronizing gesture burned. "You'll love the floral installations," he said. "There's even a string quartet." I smiled, tilting my head in agreement, while my thoughts drifted to my handbag, specifically the slim USB drive tucked inside. Earlier that week, I'd met with a friend from my consulting days, someone who now audited event security for high-net-worth gatherings. He'd given me everything I needed. The atrium was indeed beautiful, all curated serenity and imported orchids. I walked slowly, pretending to admire the petals while scanning for cameras, 2 overhead, 1 by the fountain, and none near the hallway to the staff lounge. I waited until a pair of caterers pushed through the double doors, then slipped behind them like I belonged. It only took 15 seconds to reach the maintenance closet. Inside, I plugged the drive into a network access point used for lighting controls. My friend had explained that once the gala's local server synced with the drive, any security footage recorded tonight would be automatically duplicated and uploaded to a cloud folder. The footage would be timestamped, geotagged, and scrubbed clean of my presence. He called it passive visibility, seeing everything without being seen. I called it insurance. By the time I returned to the ballroom, Lucas was already tipsy, holding court near the bar while Elena laughed at something only he could hear. He looked at me and smiled with exaggerated fondness, beckoning me over like I was a favorite possession he decided to show off. I glided across the floor in heels he hadn't noticed I bought, the ones that gave me height but made no sound. "Everything okay?" he asked, his breath rich with whiskey and confidence. "I didn't see you come back." I touched his arm and said, "I was just getting a lay of the land." Elena sipped her drink, her eyes unreadable now. "Clara's always observing," Lucas said with a chuckle. "She doesn't say much, but she remembers everything." I raised my glass in silent agreement, letting that comment sit like a planted seed. Dinner was served at long banquet tables under shimmering chandeliers. I was seated beside a man named Nathan, a venture capitalist who seemed more interested in his reflection than the food. Lucas and Elena were across from me, whispering occasionally and laughing at things only they found funny. Nathan asked if I worked, and I said, "Sometimes in shadows." He didn't get the joke, but Elena did. Her gaze sharpened for just a second before slipping back into pleasantries. Halfway through the meal, Lucas excused himself to check in with logistics. Elena followed moments later, feigning a phone call and touching her earpiece like someone in a spy movie. I counted to 30, stood, and made my way toward the West Wing. No one stopped me. I looked like I belonged. The hallway was hushed, carpeted in dark gray with gold accents. I passed 2 guards who nodded without question, then ducked into a small vestibule marked "Private Sponsors Only." There were 4 rooms down the hall, each marked with a gold plaque: Meridian, Everest, Avalon, and Locke. I waited until I heard the soft sound of laughter behind the Avalon door before pressing my ear closer. Lucas's voice came first, low and slightly slurred. "She wore green tonight. Can you believe it? Like a Christmas ornament." Elena laughed, the sound brittle and practiced. "At least she's trying," she said, and I heard the rustle of fabric. Pity effort doesn't equal elegance. That was all I needed. I turned on the small recording device I'd hidden inside the pendant around my neck. My consulting days had taught me discretion could be engineered into fashion. 5 more minutes of biting commentary and smug laughter passed before I heard the unmistakable click of heels approaching. I slipped into the Everest room, empty except for a couch and a tray of untouched pastries. Just before Elena's assistant appeared, she knocked twice on Avalon's door before slipping inside. I crouched beside the doorframe, keeping out of sight, pressing my body into the wall like muscle memory. Their conversation was muffled but clear enough. Something about a sponsor pulling out, Elena saying she's no threat, and Lucas reassuring her that I'd never figure it out. It took everything in me not to kick the door down and laugh in their faces. Instead, I stood and straightened my dress. I walked calmly back into the ballroom, head held high, chest steady with breath. My phone buzzed, an alert from the cloud folder confirming video sync complete. That was the final piece. I took my seat, folded my napkin, and waited. By dessert, Lucas had his hand on Elena's thigh under the table, hidden by the linen. I stared straight ahead, tasting the chocolate mousse like it was the sweetest thing I'd ever known. No one noticed me, and that was the point. Power lies in being overlooked until the moment you decide to be seen. I let them laugh, toast, and celebrate the night as though nothing could touch them. When we returned home, Lucas collapsed into bed without undressing. I sat beside him in the dark, brushing his hair back while he mumbled something about destiny and recognition. My face was calm, my voice even. "You deserve everything coming to you," I whispered. He didn't stir. The next morning began with headlines. Not scandal, yet, but rumblings. The whisper of exposure in powerful circles, like thunder low and distant. I smiled into my coffee, reading every word. Lucas didn't notice the change in atmosphere until we were halfway through breakfast. He was scrolling on his phone, mouth half open, when he muttered, "Weird. Someone leaked video footage from last night's gala. Looks like a side room recording." I didn't look up from my toast, simply nodded like I was just hearing about it. "Probably some staffer trying to stir drama," I said, folding my napkin neatly on my lap. His eyes flicked up to me, searching for some reaction I didn't give him. "People have no respect for privacy anymore," he added, tapping through comments on an anonymous post. "You think it's fake?" I asked, finally meeting his gaze. He paused, unsure. "Hard to tell. It cuts off before you see anyone's face, but you can hear things. By noon, whispers had turned into private messages. A contact from the legal team at Lucas's company sent a memo labeled urgent to all senior staff. The subject line read, "Gala room recordings, potential breach of conduct." I watched Lucas's fingers tremble as he typed a reply with forced casualness. "Just another overreaction," he said, not quite believing it himself. Elena didn't respond to any of Lucas's texts that afternoon. He paced our kitchen, rereading their last thread like it held secrets he'd somehow missed. "She's probably handling the PR side," he said aloud, more to himself than to me. "They'll want to trace the source, maybe scrub it before the board catches wind." I kept chopping vegetables for dinner, resisting the urge to hum. By the next day, the story had moved from private circles to curated gossip blogs. The headline was sanitized but still damning. "Anonymous Gala footage suggests inappropriate behavior among executives." They hadn't named names, but industry insiders were already stitching the pieces together. The audio was too specific, the setting too recognizable. Lucas left the house early that morning without shaving, his tie knotted wrong, mumbling about damage control. Elena finally resurfaced in a company-wide email, thick with legalese and plausible deniability. She cited, quote, unsubstantiated audio manipulation and, quote, targeted smear campaigns, but offered no outright denial. Lucas read the email 3 times, then forwarded it to his personal account. "She's playing the long game," he muttered, jaw clenched. "But she'll handle it. She always does." What he didn't know was that Elena wasn't the only one preparing a long game. I'd started receiving messages too, from anonymous burner emails and blocked numbers, each one more desperate than the last. At first, I ignored them, letting them pile up like snow. But one caught my eye, not because of what it said, but who it came from. The subject line simply read, "We need to talk," from someone who used to be on her side. I met the woman in a coffee shop across town, the kind of place where no one looked twice at quiet conversations. Her name was Marcella, and she'd worked as Elena's executive assistant for nearly 4 years. She looked younger than I expected, but the lines around her eyes said she'd aged fast in that job. "I saw the footage," she said, stirring her tea with a trembling hand. I knew it was her from the laugh. I'd recognize it anywhere. She told me things I hadn't asked for, details only someone on the inside would know. About off-the-books meetings, untraceable company cards, favors that came with silence contracts. "Elena's smart," Marcella said, eyes darting to the window. "But she got careless, started thinking no one could touch her." I said nothing, letting her talk until her guilt ran dry. Marcella had saved documents, copies of Elena's calendar, flight itineraries, audio snippets from internal calls. She slid a USB across the table, wrapped in a napkin like it was contraband. "I can't go public," she said quietly. "She'll crush me. But you're the one they think doesn't matter." I left the coffee shop with the USB in my purse and the weight of Marcella's story pressing against my ribs. When I got home, Lucas was already there, jacket slung over the armchair, shoes discarded like he owned the floor. "Elena thinks someone hacked the servers," he said, pouring wine like it was a normal Tuesday. "Internal audits starting tomorrow." I sat across from him, folded my hands, and asked, "And if they find it wasn't a hack?" He laughed, short and humorless. "They won't. No one's that good." I didn't respond, just tilted my head and smiled softly. That night, I stayed up late reviewing Marcella's files. Each one added another stitch in the tapestry of deceit. There were notes from last year's off-site retreat showing, quote, private coaching sessions between Elena and select male staff, audio files where she discussed incentive packages tied to personal favors, internal memos Marcella had intercepted, suggesting Elena had pressured legal to adjust HR reports that could have been damaging. The woman who once shook my hand with a gleam in her eye had built her empire on intimidation wrapped in inspiration. Lucas had always admired her brilliance. He just never asked what it cost. 2 nights before the board review, Lucas got a call he didn't expect. I could tell by the way his shoulders snapped back, by the clipped way he said, "Understood." When he hung up, he turned to me, eyes wide and hands twitching. "The board wants to meet with me directly," he said. "They think I might have knowledge." "You mean complicity," I offered, sipping water. He didn't deny it. "What should I do?" he asked, genuine panic now flickering in his voice. I stood slowly and crossed the room, my heels tapping out a metronome of decision. "Be honest," I said. "Tell them everything you know." He blinked like the idea had never occurred to him. "And if they ask how I know certain things, say your wife noticed patterns," I replied, "because she did." The morning of the board meeting, Lucas looked like a man walking toward his own eulogy. He wore his best Navy suit, the one he usually saved for product launches and quarterly earnings calls. His hair was slicked back too carefully, and his eyes darted like they couldn't settle on a single reality. "I should have deleted those texts," he muttered, adjusting his tie for the fourth time in the mirror. I didn't correct him. It was far too late for deletion now. He left without breakfast, and I watched from the balcony as his car disappeared down the street. I sat with my coffee, reviewing the documents Marcella had given me one more time, ensuring every timestamp matched my cloud recordings. Precision mattered. It always had. The board would need more than hearsay. They'd need a trail. And I'd made sure there was one, clean and chronological. By noon, I received my first text from an unknown number. "He's not coming out of this clean." I didn't reply, just filed the message under a new folder labeled Fallout. Then came another. Elena looked furious. "They're calling a second session." I imagined her composure cracking like glass under pressure, shards of charm and poise scattered at her feet. Even steel bends when the heat is high enough. Lucas came home 4 hours later, silent and pale, and headed straight to the liquor cabinet. He poured 2 inches of scotch, no ice, and sat on the edge of the couch like he was afraid it would reject him. "They're opening a formal review," he said after a long pause. "Internal Ethics Committee and legal." I nodded, letting him sit with the consequences he'd never thought would find him. "Elena says we need to show unity," he added, voice hollow. "She wants to go public, say it was a misunderstanding, a joke taken out of context." I tilted my head. That audio didn't sound like a joke, his hands clenched around the glass. "She says we can survive this if we spin it right." "What do you want to do, Lucas?" I asked, my voice soft but anchored. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked toward our bedroom, dragging the weight of denial behind him. The door clicked shut, and I remained in the living room, scrolling through the anonymous tips now flooding my inbox. Some were lies, some truth, but enough matched the patterns to matter. The next day brought more headlines, this time from mid-tier finance blogs with better fact-checking. "Emerging ethics scandal in health tech sector," one read, while another led with "CEO tied to inappropriate use of company resources." Still no names. Still enough breadcrumbs. Elena issued a statement through the company's PR team, tight-lipped and glittering with deflection. Lucas didn't speak to me much that week, caught between fear and misplaced loyalty. He started sleeping in the guest room, claiming he needed space to think. I didn't argue. He'd long since stopped thinking about me. What he failed to grasp was that I was never trying to destroy him. I was just done protecting him. By Friday, the board had suspended Elena's duties pending review and named an interim CEO. Lucas received an email thanking him for his discuss and reminding him that further discussion would be under legal advisement. That night, he knocked gently on my door for the first time in days. "We should talk," he said. I closed my laptop slowly and met his eyes. "I know you were behind the footage," he said, voice steady but bruised. "You've always been good at the invisible stuff." I didn't deny it. There was no point. "Why now?" he asked. "Why expose everything like that?" I walked to the window, watching streetlights flicker to life one by one. "Because watching you humiliate me wasn't enough for you," I said without turning. "You wanted me to see it, feel it, live with it." His silence confirmed what I'd always known. The betrayal wasn't accidental, it was theater. You said I was safe, predictable, boring, I continued, finally facing him. But what I really was observant. He swallowed hard, but didn't interrupt. You gave her power over your career and mocked me for lacking ambition. You mistook silence for submission, order for fear. But all I did was wait. Lucas sat down, like the weight of those words knocked something out of him. "What happens now?" he asked. I considered lying, saying I hadn't decided yet, but the truth was clear. "Now," I said, "you get to survive the consequences." His shoulders sank, and he didn't respond. The next week was a blur of depositions, strategy meetings, and lawyer speak. I kept my distance, tending to my own consulting clients, quietly rebuilding my business profile under my maiden name. Lucas didn't ask where I was going in the mornings or what I was working on at night. He just kept waiting for the sky to fall. And it did. The ethics committee released a summary of findings on a Monday morning, 7 pages of polished damnation. While it didn't name Elena directly, the implications were obvious: misappropriation of funds, abuse of authority, and violations of corporate conduct. Lucas was listed as a cooperating witness, spared formal consequence but not public scrutiny. Elena's termination was announced by noon, effective immediately. Her name was scrubbed from the company site by evening. The press came next, first financial outlets, then lifestyle columns, then gossip blogs. Lucas's name trended for 2 hours on a Wednesday morning before being bumped by celebrity drama. But in our world, it stuck like oil on glass. He was no longer a promising VP or the CEO's protege. He was collateral damage in a high-profile collapse. 2 days later, Marcella emailed me one final time. "Thank you for seeing the pattern, for not letting her get away with it again." I didn't reply, but I reread her words twice. They reminded me that I hadn't just been cleaning house. I'd been restoring balance. Truth, after all, deserved its own spotlight. The following weekend, our apartment felt too quiet, like the walls had absorbed everything Lucas refused to say. He barely left the couch, only shifting positions when the sun changed angles on the rug. I walked past him without comment, pouring myself coffee and checking the market like it was any other Saturday. If he was waiting for sympathy, he'd misunderstood the terms of our arrangement. I hadn't orchestrated his fall. I'd simply stopped cushioning it. The public fallout escalated faster than I anticipated, mostly because Elena refused to disappear quietly. She released a statement through her lawyer claiming, quote, coordinated defamation, and suggested a jealous spouse had manipulated events. Lucas read it aloud at dinner with a bitter laugh, then muttered, "She means you." I chewed slowly, wiped my lips, and replied, "You were in the room, Lucas. She didn't manipulate your hands." By Monday, the finance blogs dissected every detail of the scandal, mapping connections between Elena's tenure and suspicious severance packages. People started coming forward: junior staff, former assistants, old investors with long memories. They shared patterns that matched what Marcella gave me, solidifying a story that could no longer be rewritten. Elena's empire didn't crumble because of one woman. It collapsed because it was rotten at the core. Lucas began avoiding calls from colleagues, even the ones who once envied his access. His phone rang less with each passing day, and the silence became a verdict in itself. His confidence dimmed, retreating behind long hours spent on the patio, watching nothing. "I might not get hired again," he said one night, gripping his drink too tightly. "This follows you, even when it's not all your fault." He wanted me to say something reassuring, to offer absolution wrapped in empathy, but I didn't, because I'd done that too many times before. Instead, I replied, "It only follows people who helped it happen." His jaw twitched, but he didn't argue. He knew better now. I filed for separation the following Friday, not out of anger, but out of precision. The lawyer I hired specialized in high-conflict dissolutions and data-driven settlements. She reviewed my financial portfolio, investments, consulting revenue, silent ownership stakes, and smiled. "He's going to be surprised," she said, flipping through spreadsheets. You've been preparing this longer than most people prepare for marriage. Lucas found the papers on the kitchen counter and read them slowly, like the language might change if he gave it enough time. "You're leaving?" he asked, as if this hadn't been inevitable. "I'm closing a chapter," I said. "You mistook my stillness for compliance. But I've always been moving." The next day, I moved into a condo I'd purchased 6 months prior under an LLC. It overlooked the harbor, with a minimalist design and a wall of glass that made the ocean feel like it belonged to me. I didn't take much from the apartment, just my laptop, a few clothes, and the green dress from the gala. The rest I left behind, like a skin I'd outgrown. Lucas didn't try to stop me. In the weeks that followed, he reached out with careful texts. "Can we talk? Just coffee. No pressure." "I'm not okay, Clara." I didn't respond. Each message was a fossil of a man who once believed I'd never see his shadows. I focused on rebuilding, refining my consulting brand, onboarding 2 new clients, and expanding my portfolio into emerging markets. Every move I made was intentional, a reclamation of autonomy wrapped in logic. My name began appearing in quiet corners of the business world, praised not for flash, but for foresight. The woman once mocked as a frigid spouse now advised founders on crisis navigation and ethical restructuring. My stillness had evolved into command. 3 months after Elena's fall, she appeared on a podcast that specialized in executive resilience. Her voice was still smooth, still dripping with authority, but it cracked when she mentioned betrayal. "People love to destroy what they don't understand," she said, "especially women who can't compete." I watched the video with a glass of wine and an analytical mind. Elena didn't understand that I hadn't competed, I'd observed. I hadn't chased her power. I'd revealed its scaffolding. Her empire wasn't threatened by another alpha. It was undone by someone who saw the floor plans. Lucas, in contrast, had gone radio silent. A mutual friend mentioned he was staying with a cousin in New Mexico, trying to find clarity. Sometimes I wondered if he found it, clarity, or even humility. But I didn't linger on that thought. I had traded in daydreams for data, empathy for boundaries. The version of Clara, who once waited at the kitchen island for Lucas to notice her, no longer existed. She'd been replaced by someone too focused to be diminished. One evening, I received a letter in the mail, hand-addressed with deliberate penmanship. Inside was a simple card and a folded page. Marcella's handwriting, elegant and firm. They offered me a settlement to stay silent. I declined. "I'm speaking next month at a panel on workplace ethics. Your story gave me the courage to stop hiding." I placed the letter beside my monitor and smiled. Stories don't have to be loud to change things. Sometimes, the quietest ones echo the longest. I never sought revenge, only truth. Measurable, traceable, undeniable truth. Elena lost her empire because she built it on exploited silence. Lucas lost me because he thought I'd never noticed the cracks. My condo felt warmer than any place we'd ever lived together, not because of its decor, but because I'd chosen it. There were no apologies in its corners, no echoes of forced affection. I kept the windows open, letting the sea air clear out whatever ghosts lingered. And when I looked in the mirror now, I didn't see the woman Lucas had tried to reshape. I saw the one he never fully saw until it was too late. Before I narrate what happens next, kindly let me know what city or country you're watching from and why you haven't subscribed yet. 3 months into my new life, I attended a conference on ethical leadership where Marcella was one of the keynote speakers. She wore a soft gray suit and spoke with a calm that could only come from surviving something ruthless. When she referenced the, quote, pattern recognition skills of women dismissed as irrelevant, a few people glanced in my direction. I didn't shift in my seat. I let the words land and settle where they belonged. We weren't just reclaiming space. We were redefining the blueprint. After the talk, Marcella approached me near the refreshment table, her eyes scanning for familiarity. "They asked if I wanted to redact names," she said, holding a cup of tea like a truth she wouldn't drop. "I told them the truth isn't slander." I nodded once and she smiled. "You always were 5 moves ahead," she added. That night, I lay on my couch, watching the city pulse through the tall windows of my condo. The skyline didn't look different, but I did. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was curating. Every conversation, every partnership, every project I took on passed through a new filter. Was it built on clarity? Or was it just another performance dressed as ambition? One of my clients, a boutique investment firm, asked if I'd be interested in a long-term strategic role. It would require visibility, panels, press, and likely questions about my past with Lucas and Elena's firm. "We'd understand if that makes you hesitant," the partner said, her voice cautiously respectful. "We admire what you did, but the public loves drama more than justice." I thought about it for a moment before replying. "I didn't create the drama," I said. "I just made sure no one could keep rewriting the ending." She smiled at that and handed me a non-disclosure form written with unusual precision. I signed it without blinking, knowing that clarity never needed embellishment. I didn't want revenge on my resume. I wanted discernment. Meanwhile, Lucas remained a ghost in the background of my life. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he'd taken up consulting for early-stage startups in the Southwest, offering business strategy at a discount. His name hadn't surfaced in the press since the company quietly removed his profile from their leadership archives. He'd never been fired, technically, just shuffled into irrelevance, the kind of exile that leaves a man wondering where the applause went. Elena, on the other hand, had resurfaced in subtler ways, a new LLC under a generic name. A few thought leadership pieces on niche business sites, carefully avoiding her old title. But the industry hadn't forgotten. Her name triggered raised eyebrows in rooms that used to celebrate her. Her charisma had curdled into something people couldn't quite trust anymore. The thing about reputations built on mystique is that once you peel back the mystery, there's nothing left to worship. Elena had thrived on being unapproachable, untouchable, undefined. But once the footage aired and the patterns emerged, she became a case study, not a leader. I never had to speak her name again. The data had spoken for me. She'd mistaken my silence for absence. One afternoon, I received a message from Harper, one of Lucas's former colleagues who'd always seemed neutral. She asked if we could meet for coffee, clarifying that it wasn't about Lucas or Elena, just something she wanted to share. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and chose a cafe in a public plaza with glass walls and clear exits. Harper arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in business casual, and an expression tinged with remorse. "I owe you an apology," she said, not even bothering to order a drink. She admitted to having known more than she let on about the side meetings, the whispered promotions, the rewards for loyalty that had nothing to do with performance. "I saw it, but I didn't stop it," she said, twisting a napkin in her hands. "I told myself it wasn't my battle." I nodded, not to absolve her, but to acknowledge the cost of complicity. "Silence doesn't protect anyone," I said. "It just delays the damage." Harper looked at me like she wanted something, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps a blueprint for surviving exposure. I didn't give her either. I left the conversation with a simple truth. Some people learn by watching, others only when they lose. Harper had finally chosen to see, but too late to matter. Seeing isn't redemption if it comes after the smoke. By the end of the fiscal year, I'd grown my firm enough to hire a small team, 3 analysts and 1 project manager. All women, all sharp, all previously edged out by louder, less capable men. We didn't need a revenge anthem to motivate us, just space to work without being underestimated. Our office was quiet but humming, the air filled with focus instead of performance. The walls held whiteboards, not vision boards. One day, while finalizing a report on executive succession strategies, my assistant poked her head in. "Someone dropped this off at the front desk for you," she said, holding a manila envelope. It had no return address, just my name in clean handwriting I hadn't seen in months. I waited until the office emptied to open it, something in me both wary and curious. Inside were 2 things, a letter and a photo. The letter was from Lucas. He'd written it by hand, which surprised me, since most of his communication had always been digital and shallow. He didn't ask for forgiveness or pity, just said he now understood what I meant by pattern recognition. "You always saw what I didn't," he wrote, "and I let ego make me blind." The photo was of us, taken during our 3rd year of marriage on a trip to Iceland. I'd forgotten it even existed. Us in thick jackets, standing in front of a glacier, our cheeks red from cold and laughter. I stared at it for a long time, not out of nostalgia, but to study the timeline. That was before Elena, before boardrooms and betrayal, before ambition had become a wedge instead of a bridge. We had loved each other once, but we hadn't evolved together. I placed the letter in my drawer and the photo on my shelf, not as a keepsake, but as a case study. Every story leaves data behind. Every fall begins with overlooked signals. I hadn't destroyed Lucas. I'd just made the data impossible to ignore. And now, I was building something new, signal by signal. The new fiscal quarter began with back-to-back meetings, but I didn't mind the rhythm. I preferred motion with direction, and our firm's pipeline was clean and growing. We were consulting for 2 regional banks on governance transparency and had just signed a tech startup with a founder who, refreshingly, wanted to do things right from day one. I worked with numbers all day but paid closer attention to people, especially those who didn't realize they were revealing themselves. Patterns didn't lie, even when people did. It wasn't until a Thursday afternoon that I saw Elena's name again. Not in an email or headline, but in the registration list for a Women in Business conference I'd been asked to keynote. She was listed as a breakout session moderator under a new organization name, something vague and sanitized. At first I considered canceling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The idea of sharing air with her again felt like revisiting a haunted house that hadn't changed its script. But the discomfort passed, replaced by the calm clarity I'd honed to an art form. When the day of the conference arrived, I wore a navy-wrapped dress and soft gold jewelry. No statement pieces, nothing showy, just power in form and function. My speech was scheduled right after lunch, and I noticed Elena's session slotted immediately before mine, one room over. We passed each other in the hallway during setup. Her gaze brushed over me quickly, like someone pretending to look past a mirror. I didn't stop walking, but I did smile, just enough to remind her I still existed. My keynote centered on systems, how they fail, who they fail, and how to build new ones rooted in accountability. I didn't mention names, but I didn't have to. The audience responded with questions that made it clear they knew exactly what story I was telling. One woman asked how you keep your dignity when no one believes you're being wronged. I answered honestly, you stay quiet long enough to gather evidence, then speak so clearly they can't pretend you're confused. After the speech, a woman in a cobalt blazer approached me in the hallway. She introduced herself as Simone, a former HR director who had once interviewed with Elena's company and turned the offer down. Something about the culture felt off, she said. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I didn't belong there. She thanked me for validating that instinct. It's not paranoia, I replied. It's pattern recognition. Later that afternoon, while collecting my bag from the green room, I saw Elena alone at the refreshment table, swirling tea she wasn't drinking. Her name tag now read Executive Advisor Catalyst Strategies, a title vague enough to hide behind. She caught my eye and offered a guarded nod. Clara, she said, as if my name had weight she couldn't drop. You've been busy. I walked over, not out of curiosity but control. Busy building, I said. Turns out, that's easier when you're not patching holes in someone else's ship. Her lips twitched at the corners, but the smile never arrived. They think I ruined everything, she said quietly. That I miscalculated. I let the pause stretch between us before responding. You didn't miscalculate, I said. You just assumed no one was keeping a ledger. Elena blinked, and for the first time, I saw fatigue crack through her veneer. What do you want from me, Clara? She asked, not accusing, just resigned. An apology? A confession? Nothing, I said. I already got what I needed. And I walked away, leaving her there with lukewarm tea and a reputation even she didn't know how to salvage. That moment wasn't a climax. It was just another point on the graph, plotted and noted. When I returned to the office the next day, my assistant handed me a thank you card from the conference organizers and a bouquet of white lilies. They said you changed the room, she said, arranging the flowers near the window. It felt different in there. I smiled and nodded, not for the compliment, but for the confirmation that clarity always changes the atmosphere. We closed 2 major contracts that month, both referred by people who'd attended my talk. The first was a former CFO turned whistleblower. The second, a nonprofit rebuilding after a fraud scandal. Neither needed performance, they needed process. And that's where I thrived. Not in spectacle, but in systems that didn't buckle under pressure. A week later, Lucas emailed me. It wasn't long or dramatic, just a short message with a subject line that read, "Thank you." He'd been accepted into a mid-level ethics certification program for consultants. He said it was inspired by my keynote, which someone had forwarded to him anonymously. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. Some days, I caught myself wondering if he truly understood what had happened between us. Not the scandal, not the career fallout, but the quieter betrayal. The way he'd let someone else write over me while I stood beside him. But then I'd return to my screens, my charts, my team, and remember the simple truth. What you allow defines you just as much as what you resist. And I had stopped allowing. I celebrated my first year of independence with a dinner on my balcony. Marcella joined me, along with my team and 2 of our new clients. We toasted with Prosecco, laughed about bad boardroom lighting, and shared plans for the year ahead. No one needed to pretend, and no one had to whisper. It was the kind of space I'd always wanted, one where truth didn't feel like risk. After everyone left, I stayed outside watching the water shimmer under the city lights. I thought about how quiet revenge can be, how it doesn't always look like retribution or flames. Sometimes, it looks like a woman standing alone on a balcony she paid for in full, watching her past shrink behind her. I didn't need a final blow or a courtroom mic drop. I had the only thing that mattered, the last word, written in the life I now lived. 2 weeks after the conference, I received an unexpected invitation to a private business salon hosted by a former Fortune 500 executive. It was one of those exclusive gatherings where deals were made over Pinot Noir and reputation was a form of currency. The email said I'd been recommended by multiple high-integrity sources. I almost declined, but something about the phrasing intrigued me. I'd spent a year redefining my narrative. Now it was time to see how far the story had traveled. The event was held in a renovated brownstone, the kind of space that whispered wealth instead of screaming it. Art hung on the walls with the quiet confidence of generational investment, and the staff moved like silk between conversations. I recognized a few faces from the financial sector, some from tech, and 1 or 2 from nonprofit leadership, people who rarely shared space unless something serious was unfolding. I moved through the room with calm ease, making mental notes of tone, posture, and who avoided whom. Observation, as always, was my anchor. I was mid-conversation with a sustainability strategist when I felt someone approach from behind. "Clara," said a voice I hadn't heard in over a year. I turned to find Miriam Gold, the former compliance officer at Lucas and Elena's firm, the one who had quietly resigned 6 months before the scandal broke. Her hair was shorter now, her expression unreadable. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said, her tone flat but not unkind. "I could say the same," I replied, offering a polite nod. Miriam studied me for a moment before leaning in slightly. "There's a reason you're being invited to places like this now," she said. "Your name's become shorthand for restraint with results." I smiled faintly. Accuracy is its own kind of reputation. She walked away after that, leaving me with a plate of olives and a mind spinning faster than my pulse. I hadn't considered that people would see my silence as strategy rather than distance. In truth, I hadn't done it for perception. I'd done it for peace. But perception had a funny way of echoing the truth when left undisturbed. I realized then that I no longer had to tell the story. It was telling itself. Later that night, back at my condo, I sat by the window with a legal pad in my lap, making notes for a new talk I'd been asked to give at an executive ethics summit. The theme was reclaiming control after organizational collapse. I didn't plan to mention Elena, Lucas, or the scandal directly, but I'd touch every corner of it with my examples. Not out of spite, but because real healing includes honesty, and honesty needs structure. At the summit, I stood before a room of CEOs, general counsels, and board chairs, all people trained to hear only what served them. I didn't flatter them. I told them the truth. That systems don't fail in silence, they fail in collusion. That HR isn't broken, it's often complicit. That sometimes the person who seems the least disruptive is the one you should be listening to the most. After the session, an older woman approached me, her name tag reading Cynthia Lee, board director. She offered her hand and said, "We've been looking for someone to help audit our internal reporting systems, someone outside the usual suspects." I asked who "we" was, and she handed me a card with a nonprofit oversight coalition I'd been following quietly for months. "We don't want spin," she said. "We want truth without the theater." I accepted the card, knowing this was the direction I'd been quietly preparing for. That evening, I walked the harbor alone, phone on silent, coat wrapped tight against the coastal wind. I passed a restaurant Lucas and I had once eaten at during our engagement, and for the first time, the memory didn't sting. It just existed, a closed file in a well-organized cabinet. The pain wasn't erased, just refiled. That's what healing had taught me. Not to forget, but to reclassify. 3 days later, I received another letter from Lucas, this time handwritten again, but more detailed. He said he'd completed the first phase of his ethics certification and had taken a part-time role mentoring early-stage founders through a grant-funded incubator. "I don't expect anything," the letter said, "but I wanted you to know I finally understand that leadership without accountability isn't leadership at all." There was no return address, just his initials and a date. I placed the letter in the same drawer as the first, beside the photo from Iceland and Marcella's thank you note. I didn't cry, and I didn't call him. Closure wasn't a door you walked through. It was a decision you honored with boundaries. He had written his piece. I had lived mine. And now, the story was balanced. The audit work with Cynthia's coalition took up most of the next 2 months. It was deep, meticulous work. Interviews, document reviews, policy evaluations, and it pulled together every skill I'd ever learned. I brought on Marcella to help with internal culture analysis, and watching her lead sessions with composure was like watching a circle close. "Feels good to be heard without fear," she told me one evening, both of us still in blazers after 10 hours of work. Like truth doesn't always have to be whispered. Meanwhile, Elena resurfaced again, this time in an op-ed she published anonymously through a startup leadership blog. Of course, everyone knew it was her. The voice was too specific, the angle too familiar. She spoke of cancel culture, resilience, and how some women weaponize victimhood to destroy other women. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't need to. Because 2 days after the op-ed, the founder of that startup blog emailed me directly. "We didn't realize her identity when we posted it," he wrote. "Would you consider writing a counterpiece, something rooted in actual experience?" I declined with gratitude, explaining that my story didn't need defense. "Truth withstands spin," I said. "Let hers unravel naturally." At our firm, we began developing a workshop called Damage Doesn't Mean Destruction, designed for companies recovering from leadership scandals. It focused on triage, narrative correction, and rebuilding structures with internal integrity. Clients started requesting it by name, not because it promised immunity, but because it promised honesty. It was the first offering with my name explicitly attached. When my assistant asked if I wanted to trademark it, I paused before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I was finally ready to be visible. The same woman who once stood silently in her husband's shadow now signed her name to a workshop designed to teach people how to recover from betrayal. I said yes. Then I signed the form. By spring, our firm's reputation had evolved from niche consultancy to a quiet authority in the ethics and compliance space. We weren't flashy, but we were known, sought out by organizations that had hit walls they could no longer ignore. Our signature workshop, Damage Doesn't Mean Destruction, had been picked up by 2 universities for leadership training, and we'd started consulting for one of the country's largest healthcare nonprofits. It wasn't just about cleaning up after bad behavior anymore. It was about building systems that discouraged it from the start. That shift felt like vindication, but more than that, it felt like legacy. One April afternoon, Marcella and I were reviewing new client proposals when my assistant entered with a puzzled look. "There's someone in the lobby," she said, voice low. "He asked to see you. Didn't give a name, but he's wearing a suit that doesn't quite fit him anymore." I knew before she finished. Lucas. I walked out to the lobby slowly, already sensing the tension hanging between intention and outcome. He stood when he saw me, holding a manila envelope like it might protect him. "I won't stay," he said quickly. There's something I wanted to give you in person." I nodded, not inviting him in, but not stopping him either. We stood near the reception desk as he handed me the envelope. "I've been writing," he said. "Not to sell or publish, just to understand." He looked thinner, older, like time had finally stopped forgiving him. "This is the last one. I thought maybe you deserved to read it before I delete it." I took the envelope and said nothing, only offering the same nod I used to give in boardrooms before delivering unwelcome truths. Back in my office, I waited until the end of the day to open it. Inside were 20 handwritten pages. No title, no dates, just ink that smudged in a few places like he'd pressed too hard. He'd written about the gala, the boardroom, the months after, the isolation, the unraveling, the slow revelation that no one comes to save a man who silences those who once held him up. He didn't ask for absolution, he just documented the math of his undoing. At the end, he wrote, "You were never the problem. You were the person I didn't deserve because I confused silence with weakness." Turns out, the person who keeps the ledgers is the one who writes the final chapter. I folded the pages, placed them in a drawer with the others, and let the air settle around me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt complete. 2 weeks later, we were asked to lead a panel at a national ethics symposium, one that, ironically, had once declined my early proposals. Marcella and I flew out together, both of us amused by how things had shifted. "Funny how they didn't return emails until we stopped chasing them," she said as we boarded the plane. "Power listens better when you stop asking to be heard." I smiled, knowing she was right. The panel was titled, "Quiet Power: How Invisible Systems Shape Corporate Survival." I wore a dark forest green blouse, the same shade as the dress I wore the night Lucas laughed with Elena behind a closed door. Marcella introduced me with a quiet nod, and I stepped to the podium with steady hands. My words were sharp but smooth, like stone that had been polished by relentless tides. I didn't use names, just scenarios. And every executive in that room recognized at least one of them. Afterward, an older gentleman in a charcoal suit approached me with a question about board risk protocols. Behind him stood a younger woman, no more than 28, clutching a notepad with stars drawn in the margins. She waited until he left before stepping forward. "I'm still in grad school," she said, "but I followed everything that happened with Elena's company. You didn't speak once during the scandal, but you didn't have to. It was precise." I thanked her, trying not to let the emotions slip through. "Clarity doesn't always require volume," I replied. She nodded, cheeks flushing. "I want to do what you do someday," I smiled gently. "Then start now. Take notes, watch closely, and when everyone's busy performing, be the one who's building." Back at the hotel that night, I stared at the city skyline from my suite's balcony. The lights blinked like data points on an infinite grid, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was looking up. I felt like I was looking across, not because I was finally at the top, but because I'd stopped trying to climb ladders that leaned against walls, built by people I no longer respected. Lucas had asked me once what I was going to do about everything. The answer had taken time to arrive, but now it was clear. I'd become everything they thought I couldn't be, without ever becoming them. 3 months later, I received a certified letter from a legal office I didn't recognize. It turned out to be a settlement agreement from Elena, sent through her latest holding company. No admission of guilt, no apology, just a financial offer to resolve unspoken conflicts. The sum was substantial, enough to suggest concern. I scanned the document, closed the folder, and never responded. She wasn't reaching out because she feared me. She was reaching out because she knew I'd already won. My victory wasn't in dollars. It was in influence, structure, credibility. She could write all the anonymous op-eds she wanted. I had moved on while she was still defending an empire that had fallen under its own weight. Some legacies are cemented. Others are erased. In the fall, our firm expanded into a second location. Just 2 floors up, same building, more space. My team was growing, not just in size, but in depth. Analysts who had once been overlooked for being too quiet were now leading audits with precision. No one in our office raised their voice to be heard. They just did the work. One evening, as I walked the new floor alone, I passed the glass conference room we hadn't finished furnishing yet. The sunset reflected on the table, scattering light across the walls in a way that reminded me of stained glass. I stood there, thinking about the room where it had all started. Lucas's gala, the whispered laughter, the closed doors. And I realized, finally, that I didn't feel haunted anymore. I felt free. The 1-year anniversary of the gala arrived without ceremony, just another date on the calendar. But as I poured my morning coffee and glanced at the time, I felt my breath catch for a moment. This time last year, I was adjusting Lucas's tie, playing the role of supportive spouse while they laughed behind closed doors. I thought of that green dress now hanging untouched in my guest room closet, a silent witness to everything that had unfolded. It wasn't grief that tightened my chest. It was the memory of becoming aware. Later that day, I received a message from Cynthia Lee, the board director I'd consulted with months ago. Her organization wanted to feature me in a series on ethical recovery and structural resilience. The theme is surviving while underestimated, she wrote. You're the only person everyone unanimously agreed had to be included. I accepted, not for visibility, but because I knew how many people still whispered truths into empty rooms, waiting to be heard. The interview took place in a simple studio. White walls, clean lines, one camera. I wore a charcoal blazer, a soft cream blouse, and a gold pin shaped like a compass, a gift from Marcella after our 10th successful client audit. The producer asked if I wanted questions in advance, but I declined. Let's keep it real, I said. If I've learned anything, it's that honesty doesn't need rehearsal. The questions ranged from tactical to personal. How did you know when it was time to act? What gave you the courage to stand alone? Did you ever want to burn it all down? I answered without hesitation. I didn't want destruction. I wanted disclosure. After the interview, the producer asked if there was anything I wished people understood better. I thought for a moment, then replied that sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one keeping receipts while everyone else is performing. He smiled and nodded, jotting it down for the pull quote. I walked out of the studio into soft early evening light, the air warm and breezy with the scent of something blooming. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was just spring. That weekend, Marcella and I hosted a retreat for rising women leaders, all under 40 and already showing signs of quiet brilliance. We called it the ledger, not just for the financial nod, but for the deeper metaphor, the balance between knowing and being known. There were no trust falls or artificial bonding exercises, just workshopping patterns, practicing clear confrontation, and sharing stories that never made the press. Some of the women cried when they realized they weren't alone. One woman, Tasha, had once been passed over for a role after flagging a senior leader's misconduct. They said I wasn't collaborative, she told us, hands shaking, but all I did was refuse to cover for him. I handed her a folder labeled Document. Don't perform. Inside were templates, scripts, and checklists we'd developed over the last year. This is your new toolkit, I said. You don't have to burn bridges, but you don't have to live under them either. After the retreat, as Marcella and I cleaned up the space, she leaned against the table and exhaled slowly. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The way things used to be. I thought about it. About safety without strength. About loyalty without equity. No, I said. I miss who I could have been sooner, but I don't miss who I had to be to survive them. 3 weeks later, a news outlet published a follow-up story on the original scandal. It focused on systemic failures, not individual villainy, finally shifting the narrative from drama to infrastructure. Elena wasn't mentioned directly, but the article dissected the culture she'd helped create. Lucas's name appeared briefly in a section about bystander roles in corporate ethics. I read it over morning tea and smiled faintly at the phrase, passive proximity. The journalist had done their homework, including citations from panels, research papers, and yes, even our damage doesn't mean destruction workshop. Our work wasn't just repair anymore, it was reference. The article went viral, not because of salacious detail, but because of its tone. Thoughtful, constructive, and irrefutably grounded in evidence. Truth had finally become the headline, and I hadn't needed to say a word. That evening, a former client-turned-mentor sent me a message. "You rewrote the rules without ever picking up a sword," it read. I stared at it for a long time, letting the compliment settle. I hadn't set out to rewrite anything. I'd only ever wanted to hold the pen. In early June, my firm was nominated for an industry award recognizing innovation in ethical leadership. I was surprised by how little I cared about winning. The real milestone was that we'd been nominated by 3 separate clients, unprompted. That meant the impact wasn't just measurable, it was memorable. We'd left a mark without leaving a wound. On the night of the awards gala, I wore a sleek navy gown and a pair of gold earrings shaped like quotation marks. A small nod to all the things once said about me. Frigid, boring, safe. My team joined me at our table, laughing easily, no tension in their posture, no whispers at their backs. When our name was called as the winner, I walked to the stage slowly, calmly, every step more grounded than the last. I accepted the award with a quiet smile and said only this: "Thank you for recognizing that stillness can be strategy and precision can be power." As applause filled the room, I didn't scan the crowd for familiar faces. I wasn't looking for validation or ghosts. I'd already outlived the narrative they wrote for me. I hadn't just survived betrayal, I'd redesigned the landscape it once ruled. That night, I returned to my condo alone. I placed the award beside a stack of notebooks labeled with years, not titles. I poured a glass of wine, walked to the balcony, and stood where I'd stood many nights before. The harbor was quiet, the city moving in rhythms I no longer feared. I wasn't bracing for betrayal. I was building in peace. Thank you for listening to Clara's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.